welcome. And welcome to Beekeepers, Penquist Beekeepers, our regular meeting time, second Tuesday of every month. And we are very, very happy to have Peter Cowan with us tonight, the Bee Whisperer, and we are going to learn all about winter bees and some nukes and other things that you have prepared for us. And I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to skip the business meeting tonight and just let you share what you have to share with us tonight, Peter. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Right. Thank you very much. The tonight, what I'm intending to talk about is the way I look at single deeps, double deeps, and double nuke brood chambers, which to me means they bring more bees, more honey, and it's less work. And to some extent, things like mite treatments work better with the variety of different ways that I do things as well. So what I wanted to do is just go through initially these three different brood chamber strategies. And if I fade away, please shout so I raise my voice, because I'm trying to do it from further away than maybe the microphone will cope with. But most of us will keep the conventional hive is a two-story colony like this one, with the entrance, a couple of deeps, and that's how most of us would go through the winter. And indeed, it's how I recommend for my beginners go with double deep hives, because a bigger hive is more tolerant of stress factors and that sort of thing that we might come across. And whether we're starting a colony in its first year or whether we have a colony that's overwintered, the same principle is going to apply, just the timing is going to be a bit different. So let's picture our double deep colony in the spring. What happens there? We're usually starting with a cluster of bees up in the top, and we might reverse the brood chambers so that we get brood throughout both deeps here. Certainly as the day lengths increase and we get into May, the queen is capable of laying a good queen 2.5, maybe 3,000 eggs per day. And that means she can fill up this brood chamber pretty well and pretty quickly. Now, as that colony grows, we get to the point where we're looking at honey supers on, and certainly we may be putting a honey super on, but we might also bear in mind the risk of swarming. And so with experience comes knowing when a hive looks too strong and when a hive is looking not so strong that it'll in danger of swarming. So this just comes with experience, but basically if you've got two deep supers boiling over with bees, you need more space, or you need to thin it down, or you're going to get a swarm. So typically, if we're running things lucky, we'll put our queen excluder on, and we might put honey supers on. But before that, we might do something different. We may decide to split it, so we might make a nuke or two. So let's just work on the assumption that in order to prevent swarming, we may have taken some of our brood combs, and we start off a nuke just to take the edge off their strength. And we put a couple of get a super going. Maybe one, maybe more. Maybe we'll do one in early May. Maybe we'll do one towards the end of May, just to take the edge off their super strength. Because once we get into the honey flow, their idea about swarming tends to fade away. They start getting preoccupied with collecting food. So let's assume we've taken a nuke off the hive. A few frames of brood, we have a queen cell, or we put a new queen in here, and this colony just keeps on going. And so now we might have maybe 5 or 6 frames of brood down here, 3 or 4 frames of brood up here, with them expanding into the space that we put in here. And so we might put our queen excluder on, and put a honey super on. And we might go through June and they're filling up this honey super, and we may need another honey super. And I would say that as a good average, what I've seen, I would say that throughout Maine, it's pretty common for 2 brood chamber hive here to get a good 2 supers of honey from the hive. Sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it'll be less. But let's work on an average of 2 supers of honey, and we'll say they're mostly full, let's say 30 pounds per medium super, and then we can take these off, and by this time of year our brood chamber here is filling up with honey. So let's take our 60 pounds of honey off the hive. We take our queen excluder off, and we start preparing that for winter. So in this typical arrangement, we get roughly 2 honey supers. So actually, let me just leave that in place. It's going to use up too much space. So before we go into the winter, we have the hives, 2 honey supers on our 2 brood chambers here. So let's take a different scenario now. And that is a single brood chamber hive. Now this might be a brand new hive, or it might be like what I do a lot of, and that is overwintering single deep brood chambers. You don't need a big hive in order, a big brood chamber and lots of honey and lots of bees to make it through the winter. You're just more likely to have success that way and be tolerant of a few mishaps. With a single deep, you'll have to be more on your toes in terms of making sure mites are right down, making sure they're really well fed in the fall. But generally speaking, you'll have only a slight increase in your mortality if you know what you're doing with a single deep brood chamber. So let's take a situation where we've either got a new hive or a single deep that's come through the winter now, and it's going to grow, and probably by late April we're going to need to put a brood chamber on here. We put another brood chamber on our single deep. So now the queen is starting to move into here, and she's starting to occupy this space. Now it may only be 2nd, 3rd week of May, and this colony is now getting so strong that it's very much in potential danger of swarming. So again, like our double deep, we'll probably make a nuke to stop it swarming, or we give it lots of space and take our chances. But let's take an example where we make a nuke. We take a few frames of brood and form our nuke over here, and we put some more frames in here, and we've taken some of the edge off here. We put more frames in here, and the queen's again filling it up. And as we're getting to the beginning of the really strong honey flows, which would typically be in early June, these 2 colonies now we've made it roughly the same. So we've allowed our single brood chamber hive to go up to a double brood chamber hive. The queen is laying as fast as she can. But now what we want to do is take it back down to a single brood chamber. So what I'll typically do then is I will take this super off. I need another table here. And what I would do is I'll put a funnel on it. You might do this with an empty super. I do it with like a tote with the bottom cut out and a little rim put on. So I can just put it on the top here. And so then you take all your frames of brood, just in case your queen is upstairs. There's a very high probability the queen is in the upper brood chamber. So we make sure that all of the frames have been shaken into the lower brood chamber. So now we know the queen is just down here. We can now take our funnel off, put our queen excluder on. So I've got one back here. And we put our super, which was our upper brood chamber, and it's still full of brood, we put that back on here now. The bees go back up through the queen excluder, and this brood emerges just in time for that honey flow to get really going, and we still have a really good population of bees. What's going to happen down here below the queen excluder now is that the queen is going to demand a lot of space. Any honey, and to some extent some of the pollen that they have stored on the edges here, gets moved up, and the queen will occupy a good 8, maybe all 10 of those frames down below. In the meantime, now, as this colony grows, we put honey supers on that. And just like our double deep, we'll typically find that we'll get this backfilled with honey as that brood emerges. That gets backfilled with honey. This gets backfilled with honey. And this gets filled with honey. And I would say typically I get just the same sort of results in terms of how much space is utilized and filled with honey in both of these styles. The big difference is I'm going to harvest this one at 30 pounds, this one at 30 pounds, and this one at about 60 pounds. So I'm getting about 120 pounds out of this setup compared to the 60 pounds I get from this setup. Because by this time of year, all my second stories are absolutely full of honey. I've probably taken them off in July. But basically I will have at least 60 pounds more honey from this setup than from that setup. So in what we've done here is to maintain them both. Again, we've just looked after them. We thin them out where necessary. We may have a few nukes here. We've allowed the queen to really get going here, and by sometime in June we've restricted her back down into the bottom brood chamber. This emerges and gets backfilled with honey, and so now we've got effectively 3 honey supers, one of which is a deep one. I'll come back to why I like this so much, but basically when it comes to managing these for mite treatments, for example, here I've got to have my mite treatment work over brood in 2 supers, whereas here my mite treatments are working on the brood nice and compact here. It's very easy to see. It's easy to check for possibility of swarming, and ironically I have far fewer swarms in a single brood chamber than I do in a double brood chamber. For some reason, maybe because of how compact it is, and they're really pushing for every inch of space in here, I find I have fewer swarms from these hives than I do from these. Quite interesting. And here's another one that I have. This might even surprise you even more. So during May, I made a nuke out of each of those hives here. And I sell a lot of nukes, so making nukes is a big part of my income. And so I've been doing more and more with nukes. Now here what I've got is my 2 nukes, and I'll try and have 2 matching nukes which fit very well together here, because I've got multiple sized nukes from different arrangements I've had. And now, come let's say the 1st of June, these nukes are doing very nicely. I made them with about 3 frames of brood to take some energy off. I may have made a second nuke from them, or a third, but let's just take these 2 for an example. These are now approaching being full. They're not quite full, but they're approaching being full of brood, which is an ideal time to set up the next style of hive. Now what I do is I'll take a queen excluder and put it over the 2 of them. Now because these are 2 5-frame nukes, this queen excluder doesn't quite cover everything, so I'll put the queen excluder over to one edge here, and I will take a piece of wood which I have previously cut, and I'll just put it over this little edge here, just so it's weatherproof. The bees will propolize that down very nicely. And now what I do is I can put another super on here, and typically because I like getting more deep comb drawn, I will put a super of deep on here, of deep frames. I've got one under the table, but I'll go and get this one. So I'll put a deep on here. Now, whenever I'm putting a queen excluder on, I never put just a super of foundation. So this works well as long as you've got some drawn comb already. And all you need is 2 or 3 frames of drawn comb. The rest can be foundation, that will be fine. But I never put a whole super of foundation directly above a queen excluder because for some reason the bees just don't see that space above a queen excluder as being room they can expand into unless there's drawn comb up there. If there's drawn comb, they will very happily go up into it. If it's just foundation, I would say 3 out of 4 times there's a swarm within 2 weeks. And so that's the one thing that I'd say most beginners have their very first swarm the 2 weeks after they put their first honey super on, because they've not been told not to put a queen excluder on and then a super foundation. So that's a separate issue, but one well worth remembering for any beginners or passing on to your mentees as beginners. Never put a super of foundation straight above a queen excluder. 3 out of 4 times you're going to get a swarm if you do. If you've got drawn comb above it, no problem. Ironically, you would think that with these little nukes, you're not going to get very much progress, but you do. And in fact, it's funny. I don't know if it's because it's the Sassafras bees I use or what, but what I find is that I not only end up putting 1 deep on, I will typically be able to put at least 1 more deep on there, and sometimes that is just foundation because it's already above the queen excluder. Last year I did this with I think it was 10 setups like this. In almost all of them, it was 6 setups like this last year I did. In 5 out of the 6, I ended up with 3 deep honey supers, 3 deep brood chambers full of honey. Roughly 150 to 180 pounds from just 2 5-frame nukes. Now, the real advantage of doing this is that these 5-frame nukes, they're brand new queens, and the queen never is able to lay more than 5 combs. She keeps 5 combs going, but she really keeps them full. Those 5 combs are full of brood. So she's never having to lay that full 2,500 to 3,000 eggs per day. But because there's plenty of space for them to put their extra resources, if you're looking to maintain a nuke for next year, this is a great way because number one, you don't burn out the queen. She doesn't have gone through a whole season of laying at 2,500 to 3,000 eggs per day. She's laying 1,500 eggs a day, maybe 2,000 for initially, and then she has to slow down. Both of these queens are in great shape for next year. And I overwinter these single 5-frame nukes very, very successfully as well. And in a second I'll show you how I go about it. But I will also, I will typically have another honey super on here, maybe 2, let's say, rather than another deep, I put on 2 mediums here. And so again, I will typically get over 100 pounds, typically 120 pounds from my 2 nukes. That's 60 pounds per nuke. And so the reason that these are so much more productive, and that for that matter, is that rather than a colony like this where the queen has unlimited space to lay, we are deliberately limiting the queen's space to lay, but in such a way that swarming doesn't seem to be that prevalent. But we initially let the queen go flat out with these ones. These queens are slightly later, so these nukes were started slightly later. So they were started in May, maybe late May. And so the queen hasn't had to get going. She's a brand new queen. She hasn't really had to get going. And so she never really gets burnt out. But so there's much less work. If you were trying to keep nukes as nuke size, you'd be continuously having to thin them out to stop them either swarming or to put their energy elsewhere. But instead, what they do is they put all of their energy into honey production. And what's going on in there is, instead of a hive like this where there's a lot of brood to look after, we have an enormous number of house bees, young house bees, whose job it is to look after the brood. When we have a slightly rather smaller brood population, say in the case of these 5-frame nukes, to take it as more of an extreme, what happens here is it's still producing a lot of bees, but relative to the volume of the hive, there's a lot less brood to look after. And so instead of those house bees staying as house bees till they're roughly 3 weeks old, they get promoted to field bees at roughly 2 weeks old. This is rough estimates here, but I think that that's what's going on. Basically, what they're doing is prematurely promoting house bees to the field force. Now our ratio of field bees to house bees is much higher, therefore honey production is much greater. And so this is a great way to really increase honey production, and the other advantage is it gives you fresh nukes ready for next spring to stock up our single brood chamber hives or our double brood chamber hives, or to take into account the mortalities that we've got as well. So this is a great way of minimizing the work required to look after look after nukes, because trying to maintain a nuke in a 5-frame box is pretty hard. This way they just put all their extra energy into honey production instead of wanting to fly off as a swarm. And I almost never get swarms from my 5-frame nukes either when I do this. They just put all their energy into honey production. And the two groups of bees, what I forgot to mention here when I put the queen excluder on, what's happening here, the two groups of bees are working just like one unit here. The two queens are kept totally separate. So let's just go back to that again. We've got a queen in this box, a queen in this box. They're not able to cross this barrier across the middle. So this queen stays here, this queen stays here, but their workforce joins together upstairs. They just act like one big population, and it works beautifully. And as I say, per hive stand, these nukes produce more honey than either of those. It really is amazing. For some reason, it just really suits the bees that I'm working with.